Welcome back to Soft Mystic Stories. Picture this. You're lying in the dark, nearly asleep, and you hear it. That soft, rhythmic purr beside you. Maybe there's a warm weight on your chest, or curled against your legs. A cat. Your cat. Just another Tuesday night. But here's what's wild. That creature purring next to you is the end result of a journey that spans 12,000 years. Its ancestors stalked the shadows of the world's first cities, rode in the cargo holds of Viking longships, survived witch hunts and plagues, and somehow convinced humans to build entire civilizations around their comfort, and we barely noticed it happening. Today, there are over 600 million domestic cats living on Earth. They're in penhouses in Dubai, fishing villages in Japan, farms in Iowa, apartments in St. Paulo. They've colonized every continent except Antarctica. And honestly, they'd probably manage that too, if we'd just build them a heated research station. But if you had looked at the world 12,000 years ago, there were no house cats. Zero. Just wild predators in the Middle Eastern wilderness who wanted absolutely nothing to do with cats, humans. So what happened? How did we get from there to here? From wild hunters who avoided people, to animals that deliberately seek out our laps, our beds, our warmest spots by the fire. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So, maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. Check comments, and it's fascinating. Tokyo, at sunrise, Toronto, at midnight. Someone in Iceland at 3 o'clock a.m. because the sun won't set. All of you falling asleep to stories about cats. The story you're about to hear isn't what you think. It's not really about us domesticating cats. That's the thing. We didn't domesticate them. Not the way we domesticated dogs or horses or cows. Those animals we actively bred and shaped and controlled over thousands of years. Cats. Cats domesticated themselves. And that changes everything. See? Most people think ancient humans saw a cute wild cat and decided to make it a pet. That's not how it happened. What actually happened was far stranger and far more interesting. Around 10,000 BC, humans in the Fertile Crescent figured out agriculture. We stopped wandering around, hunting and gathering, and we started staying in one place, growing grain, storing food. And you know what loves stored grain? Mice, rats, rodents of every description. They descended on our grain stores like an army. And you know what loves mice and rats? Wild cats. So these small wild cats, Felis silvestris, started hanging around human settlements, not because they liked us, because we'd accidentally created an all-you-can-eat buffet of their favorite prey. The boldest ones, the ones who could tolerate being near humans without freaking out, got access to the best hunting grounds. They ate well. They had more kittens, and those kittens inherited their parents' slightly lower fear of humans. Generation after generation, the cats that were just a little bit friendlier, just a little bit calmer around people thrived. And we let them, because they were solving our rodent problem. It was the perfect partnership. Except nobody planned it. It just happened. But here's where the questions get really interesting. Did the ancient Egyptians actually worship cats? Or is that a myth we've blown out of proportion? How did cats survive the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church declared them servants of Satan? Why are there cat cafes in every major city, but dog cafes never quite caught on? How did an animal that humans never fully controlled become one of the most successful mammals on the planet? And here's the biggest mystery of all. After 12,000 years of living with humans, cats are still only semi-domesticated. Dogs have been shaped by human breeding into hundreds of wildly different forms. Great Danes and Chihuahua barely look like the same species. But cats, a tabby cat in your living room, could still survive in the wild tomorrow if it had to. Put a golden retriever in the forest, and it'll be confused and scared. Put a house cat in the forest, and it'll hunt, kill, and thrive. So, who really domesticated who? Maybe the better question is, did cats look at early human civilization and decide we were useful enough to keep around? Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through the entire history of cats. From the wild ancestors prowling the ancient Middle East to the viral videos dominating your social media feed. We'll visit ancient Egypt when cats were sacred, medieval Europe when they were hunted, Victorian England, when they became fashionable, and the modern internet age, when they somehow became the unofficial mascots of digital culture. It's a story nobody tells completely, because it's not really in the history books. Cats existed alongside human civilization, shaping it in quiet ways, leaving paw prints we didn't notice until we looked back. They witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They walked the decks of ships that discovered new continents. They survived persecutions that should have wiped them out. And through it all, they never quite became ours. We just became useful to them. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's go back. Way back to a time before cities, before kingdoms, before anyone had ever heard a purr in the dark and felt comforted by it. Let's go to where it all began. 10,000 BC. The world is warming. Ice sheets that have covered half of Europe and Asia for 100,000 years are finally retreating. Sea levels are rising. Coastlines are shifting. And in a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, something revolutionary is about to happen. Humans are about to stop wandering and start settling down. They don't know it yet, but when they do, they're going to need help. And that help is going to come from a small, tauri-colored predator that's been watching them from the shadows for thousands of years. Meet Fel Sylvester's Liber, the African wildcat. Your cat's great-great-great-great-grandmother, going back about 10,000 generations. She weighs maybe 8 pounds, stands about 10 in at the shoulder, and could fit comfortably in your backpack. She has sandy-colored fur with faint stripes on her legs and tail, a white belly, and eyes that glow amber in the firelight of human camps. She's a solitary hunter. She doesn't need anyone. She's been surviving just fine on her own for hundreds of thousands of years. Thank you, very much. But she's about to make a choice that will change everything. Not just for her species, but for humanity itself. The genetic evidence is remarkable. In 2007, researchers analyzed the DNA of nearly 1,000 domestic cats from around the world, along with samples from all 5 subspecies of wild cats. They were looking for the origin point, the ancestral population that gave rise to every house cat alive today. What they found was surprising, not because it was ambiguous, but because it was so clear. Every domestic cat from Maine Coons to Siamese, from Egyptian mouse to random alleys in Tokyo, they all trace their maternal lineage back to Felis sylvestris liber, the African wildcat. And not just any African wildcats, but specifically populations living in the Near East, in the PAR region we now call the Fertile Crescent. This is where the story really begins. Picture the landscape. It's not the desert you might imagine when you hear Near East or Middle East. 10,000 years ago, this region is lush. Rolling grasslands stretch for hundreds of miles. Oak forests cover the hillsides. Rivers flow year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt and seasonal rains. Wild wheat and barley grow in dense stands across the valleys. Herds of gazelle graze the plains. Wild boar root through the forests. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are rodents, mice, rats, voles, gerbils, ground squirrels. They're thriving in this post-Ice Age abundance, multiplying faster than the predators can keep them in check. And the wildcats, they're in heaven. A solitary African wildcat needs to catch about 4 or 5 rodents a day to survive. In this environment, that's easy. They hunt at dawn and dusk crepuscular predators, taking advantage of the low light when rodents are most active, but larger predators are less effective. Their hearing is phenomenal. They can detect the ultrasonic squeaks of mice from dozens of feet away. Their eyes have a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer that amplifies available light, letting them see in conditions that would leave other predators stumbling blind. They're perfectly adapted ambush hunters, patient, silent, deadly. But here's what's crucial. They're not pack animals. They're not social. Each wildcat maintains a territory of several square miles. Males and females only come together briefly to mate, then go their separate ways. Mothers raise kittens alone for a few months, teaching them to hunt, then drive them off to find their own territories. This is not a species that cooperates. This is a species that tolerates absolutely zero competition for resources within its hunting grounds. Put two wild cats in the same territory, and they'll fight viciously until one leaves or dies. So why did they become domesticated when other wild cats didn't? That's the fascinating question. Because Felis sylvestris liber isn't the only wildcat subspecies. There are 5 main groups all descended from a common ancestor that lived about 1 million years ago. The European wildcat Felis sylvestris is larger and more aggressive with thicker fur and a bushier tail. Beautiful animals, absolutely untamable. Conservationists have tried for decades to breed European wildcats in captivity, and they remain as wild in the 20th generation as they were in the first. Even hand-raised from birth, European wildcat kittens grow into animals that will never tolerate human touch. The Asian wildcats scattered from India to China are similarly resistant to domestication. There's some evidence that ancient Chinese populations tried to domesticate the leopard cat, Prionus bengalensis, around 5,000 years ago. Archaeological sites in China contain leopard cat bones, showing they lived alongside humans. But it didn't stick. Whatever relationship developed, it didn't persist. Chinese domestic cats today are all descended from the same Near Eastern populations as everyone else's cats. So, what made Felis sylvestris liber different? The answer seems to be temperament, not friendliness exactly. Nobody's claiming these wild cats were naturally cuddly, but they had a higher tolerance for stress, a lower aggression threshold toward unfamiliar situations. When something changed in their environment, European wildcats fled or fought. African wildcats were more likely to watch and wait to assess whether the change presented danger or opportunity. This tiny difference in baseline temperament was enough, because when humans started settling down in the Fertile Crescent, they created the opportunity of a lifetime for any wild cat bold enough to take it. The genetic studies that pinpointed this origin are remarkable pieces of scientific, detective work. Researchers didn't just look at modern cats. They extracted DNA from archaeological cat bones found at ancient human settlements across the Near East, Europe, and Africa. Some of these bones were 9,000 years old. By comparing ancient and modern DNA, they could track how cats spread from their origin point. The data shows at least 5 distinct maternal lineages, 5 separate groups of African wild cats that contributed to the domestic cat gene pool. But all 5 groups lived in the same region, the Fertile Crescent in what's now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Jordan. Even more remarkably, the domestication process left barely any mark on cat genetics. This is completely different from dogs or sheep or cattle, or basically any other domestic animal. Dog domestication involved massive genetic changes. Modern dogs look nothing like wolves. Their bones are different, their brains are smaller, their behavior is radically transformed. 30,000 years of selective breeding created hundreds of distinct breeds, each specialized for different tasks. Cats. Cats are basically still wild cats. A domestic cat and an African wild cat can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Their skeletons are nearly identical. Until about 200 years ago, you literally couldn't tell a domestic cat's skeleton from a wild cat's skeleton by looking at the bones alone. This tells us something profound about how cat domestication happened. It wasn't selective breeding. Not at first, not for thousands of years. Humans didn't capture wild cats and breed the tamest ones the way they did with wolves. Cats domesticated themselves. They chose us. Or more precisely, they chose the ecological niche we created. Think about what those early wild cats were like. Solitary, territorial, crepuscular hunters that spent most of the day sleeping in hidden spots, emerging at dawn and dusk to hunt. Their diet was almost entirely small rodents, supplemented occasionally with birds, lizards, or large insects. They were ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They'd find a good spot near rodent trails or burrows, settle in completely motionless for hours if necessary, then explode into action when prey appeared. The strike would last seconds. The meal would be consumed quickly, often in the same spot where the kill happened, then back to the resting spot to sleep and digest. They were also incredibly efficient predators. Studies of modern African wild cats in Africa show they have a hunting success rate of around 60%. That's extraordinary. Lions succeed maybe 25% of the time. Cheetahs, despite their incredible speed, only catch prey in about half their hunts. Wildcats, hunting creatures a fraction of their size in grass and brush, succeed more often than almost any other carnivore. This efficiency meant they didn't need huge territories if prey was abundant. In optimal conditions, a wildcat might maintain a territory of just 1 or 2 square kilometers. Now imagine what happens when humans start settling down, when they stop moving with the seasons and start building permanent settlements, when they start cultivating wheat and barley, storing harvested grain in granaries and storage pits, when they start creating the first concentrated year-round food sources in human history. The rodents notice immediately. Mice and rats have been following humans opportunistically for millennia, picking up scraps from campsites, raiding food stores. But permanent settlements with grain storage, that's paradise. Rodent populations explode around early agricultural villages. Archaeological evidence shows massive increases in commensal rodent species. Animals adapted to living alongside humans right when permanent settlements appear. And the wild cats notice the rodents. A village with grain stores is surrounded by the highest density of prey these cats have ever encountered. More rodents in a 100-meter radius than they'd normally find in their entire territory. And they're easy to catch. Emboldened by abundance, careless around food sources. For a wild cat willing to overcome its natural weariness of humans, willing to hunt in the shadows around human settlements, the payoff is enormous. So they came, not all at once, not as a species. Individual cats, bolder than average, hungry enough or curious enough to take the risk. They discovered that humans, busy with their crops and their pottery and their increasingly complex social lives, mostly ignored them. Maybe occasionally threw stones if a cat got too close during daylight hours, but generally humans tolerated them because the humans had noticed something too. Villages with cats had fewer rodents. Grain stores lasted longer. Disease spread less readily. Those early farmers didn't understand germ theory, didn't know that rodents carried plague and typhus and a dozen other deadly infections. But they understood cause and effect. Cats around meant fewer rats. Fewer rats meant more food survived to feed the village through winter. A partnership was forming. Not friendship yet. Not trust, but mutual tolerance based on mutual benefit. The cats got easy hunting. The humans got pest control. And both species got something else. Something neither could have predicted. They got each other. For the next 10,000 years, these two species were going to shape each other in ways that would eventually lead to cat videos getting 1 billion views on the internet. But that was far in the future. For now, in the early dawn light of the Neolithic Revolution, there were just a few wild cats creeping closer to human settlements, taking the first tentative steps toward a relationship that would carry them across the entire world. The age of the domestic cat was beginning. Picture this. It's around 10,000 BC. The Ice Age is finally loosening its grip. Your ancestors have spent the last 50,000 years as nomadic hunters and gatherers, following game herds, collecting wild plants, living in temporary camps that you abandon when the resources run out. But something is changing. In a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern-day Egypt through Israel, Syria, and Iraq down to the Persian Gulf, people are starting to notice something interesting. Those wild grasses they've been harvesting, the ones with the fat seed heads, they're growing back in the same places year after year. And if you're careful about how you harvest them, if you leave some seeds behind or maybe scatter them deliberately, you get even more plants the next season. This is the beginning of agriculture, and it's about to create the perfect environment for one of the most successful partnerships in human history. A partnership that nobody planned, a relationship that would change both species involved in ways neither could have predicted. Because when humans started farming, they accidentally sent out an invitation, and cats, wild cats, who had been living their own independent lives for millions of years, decided to accept. But let's back up. Before we get to the partnership, we need to understand what humans were creating. The transition to agriculture wasn't a sudden revolution. It was a gradual shift that took thousands of years. Early farmers didn't abandon hunting and gathering overnight. They supplemented wild foods with cultivated grains, slowly increasing their reliance on crops as they figured out the best techniques. And with cultivation came a revolutionary new challenge: storage. You can't store wild game meat for months at a time. Not effectively, not in a pre-refrigeration world. But grain you can store. Grain you can keep in pits lined with clay or stone. Grain you can stockpile to feed yourself through the winter, to plant next season, to trade with neighboring communities. For the first time in human history, people were accumulating significant food surpluses, and they were keeping those surpluses in one place, concentrated, predictable, accessible. To humans, this was revolutionary. To mice and rats, this was paradise. Wild rodents had always been around scavenging whatever they could find. But now, humans had created something unprecedented. Massive concentrations of their favorite food, conveniently stored in structures that provided shelter from weather and predators. Within a few generations of the first grain storage experiments, mouse populations around human settlements exploded. Archaeological sites from early farming communities show rodent remains in staggering numbers. Some storage pits show evidence of losing 30, 40, even 50% of their contents to rodent damage. Early farmers tried everything. They dug deeper pits. They lined them with materials mice couldn't chew through. They set traps. They hunted the rodents themselves, but it was a losing battle. Mice reproduce insanely fast. A single breeding pair can produce dozens of offspring in a season, and those offspring can start breeding within weeks. You can't kill mice faster than they reproduce. Not with Neolithic technology, not by hand, but something else could. Something that had been hunting mice for millions of years, long before humans started farming. Something small enough to follow mice into their burrows, fast enough to catch them in the open, patient enough to wait by their holes for hours. Something perfectly designed by evolution to be the ultimate mouse-killing machine. Cats, specifically Felis sylvestris liber, the African wildcat. These weren't the domesticated house cats we know today. These were wild predators, solitary hunters who lived in the forests and grasslands around the Fertile Crescent. They hunted alone, avoided other cats except during mating season, and wanted absolutely nothing to do with humans. They were shy, cautious, perfectly capable of surviving without any contact with people whatsoever. But they were also pragmatic, and they could recognize an opportunity. Imagine you're one of these wild cats. You've been hunting in your territory for years, catching enough mice and small birds to survive, but always working for every meal. Competition from other predators, limited prey populations, long hours of stalking and hunting. Then one day, you notice something strange. There's a human settlement in your territory. You avoid it at first, naturally. Humans are dangerous, unpredictable. Best to stay away. But you also notice the mice. They're everywhere around the settlement. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, all fat and slow from eating stored grain. More mice than you've ever seen in your life, all concentrated in a small area. You start hunting near the settlement, just the edges at first, staying hidden, ready to run if humans get too close. But the hunting is incredible. You can catch more mice in an hour than you used to catch in a day. And the humans, they mostly ignore you. As long as you stay out of their way, don't threaten their children or steal their food. They let you hunt. Some of them even seem pleased when they see you carrying off dead mice. After a few weeks, you're spending most of your time around the settlement. Why hunt in the wild when the prey is so much easier here? This is how it started. Not with humans capturing and taming wild cats. Not with deliberate domestication, with cats making a calculated decision that life near humans, despite the risks offered, significant advantages. Scientists call this self-domestication. The animals choose to associate with humans, select themselves for the partnership, based on their own assessment of costs and benefits. It's completely different from how dogs were domesticated. Dogs became our partners through deliberate breeding and training, probably starting as tamed wolves that helped with hunting. That partnership was intentional on both sides. Humans wanted hunting partners. Wolves wanted access to food and protection. But cats just showed up. And not all cats made the same choice. Archaeological evidence suggests that only certain wild cats started hanging around human settlements. Probably the ones that were naturally less fearful, more curious, better able to tolerate proximity to humans and other cats. 'Cause here's the thing. To successfully exploit human settlements, cats had to change one of their fundamental behaviors. They had to become less territorial. In the wild, cats are solitary. Each cat maintains its own hunting territory and drives out other cats aggressively. But around human settlements with their concentrations of prey, multiple cats could coexist in a small area. The food supply was so abundant that competition wasn't necessary. Cats that could tolerate other cats that could share space without constant fighting had access to the best hunting grounds. Cats that couldn't stayed in the wild. Over hundreds of generations, this created a selection pressure unlike anything wild cats had experienced before. The most socially tolerant individuals thrived around humans, had more offspring, passed on their genes. The more aggressive, more solitary individuals stayed wild. Slowly, gradually, a new population emerged. Cats that looked like wild cats, hunted like wild cats, but behaved slightly differently. More tolerant of humans, more tolerant of each other. Not domesticated yet, not really, but moving in that direction. The humans noticed. How could they not? Their grain stores were being protected by these small, efficient predators. Losses to rodents dropped dramatically. The cats asked for nothing, needed no training, no feeding. They just hunted, and in the process, they saved harvests. In a world where a bad harvest meant starvation, where rodent damage could be the difference between survival and death, cats became valuable, not as pets, not yet, but as partners, useful animals that chose to live alongside humans. We know this happened because we found the evidence. On the island of Cyprus, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. A grave 9,500 years old, containing the remains of an adult human and a young cat buried together, deliberately, in what was clearly an intentional funeral. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, Cyprus has no native wild cats. Cats don't swim. The only way cats got to Cyprus was if humans brought them on boats, which means by 9,500 years ago, humans valued cats enough to transport them to new territories. Second, the burial suggests emotional attachment. You don't bury your pest control in a formal grave with grave goods unless you feel something for them. This wasn't just a working relationship anymore. This was the beginning of affection. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this burial predates the height of Egyptian cat worship by 6,000 years. The story of cats and humans didn't start in Egypt, as popular culture often suggests. It started much earlier in the small farming communities of the Neolithic Revolution. From these early settlements, the partnership spread. As agriculture expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually Europe and Asia, cats followed, or rather humans brought them. Founding new settlements, they brought grain, tools, livestock, and cats. Because by this point, cats weren't optional anymore. They were essential infrastructure. Without cats, your grain stores were vulnerable. With cats, you had a chance at preserving your harvest. The relationship was still fundamentally utilitarian. Cats were working animals, not companions. They lived around human settlements, but not necessarily inside human homes. They hunted for themselves, raised their kittens in hidden spots away from human interference, maintained much of their wild independence. But they were also becoming something new, more comfortable around humans than their wild ancestors, more diverse in coloration, as genetic mutations that would have been disadvantageous in the wild, making animals more visible to prey, didn't matter as much in an environment with abundant, easily caught rodents. Archaeological sites from across the ancient Near East show increasing evidence of cat remains alongside human settlements. Not as prey animals, the bones don't show butchery marks, but as residents. By 7,000 years ago, cat bones are common at farming sites from Turkey to Israel to Egypt. Some sites show cat paw prints and clay bricks that were left to dry in the sun. The cats walked across them casually, comfortable enough around humans to stroll through active work sites. By 6,000 years ago, artistic representations of cats start appearing. Figurines, carved decorations, wall paintings. Humans weren't just tolerating cats anymore. They were noticing them, thinking about them, incorporating them into their cultural expression. The stage was set for what would come next, for the civilization that would take the human-cat relationship to entirely new levels, that would transform cats from useful pest control into sacred animals, divine representatives walking among mortals. But that transformation was still thousands of years away. For now, in these early farming communities, cats and humans were simply learning to live together. Two species, each pursuing their own interests, discovering that cooperation benefited both. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't worship. It was just the beginning. The first tentative steps of a partnership that would eventually span the globe and last for 12,000 years. Around 20,000 BC, something extraordinary began happening along the Nile River. The practical pest controllers that had been living in Egyptian grain stores for over 1,000 years started appearing in places that would have seemed impossible just a few generations earlier. Temple walls, royal tombs, religious ceremonies. The cats weren't just tolerated anymore, they were being worshipped. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The earliest Egyptian artwork showing cats dates to around 2500 BC. Simple paintings depicting them doing what they did best: hunting birds in papyrus marshes, sitting beneath grain storage facilities, looking alert and predatory. They were painted the same way you'd paint any useful animal, with appreciation for their function, but no particular reverence. But then something shifted. By 2000 BC, cats were being painted differently. Now they appeared wearing collars, sitting on chairs beside their owners, being hand-fed choice morsels of fish, and most tellingly, appearing in religious contexts, their images carved into temple walls alongside gods and pharaohs. What changed? Probably several things at once. After centuries of living alongside humans, cats had become more than pest controllers. They'd become companions. Egyptian families who'd grown up with cats protecting their food stores had developed genuine affection for them. Children had played with kittens. Adults had appreciated the comfort of a purring presence on cold desert nights. The practical relationship had become emotional. But there was something else. The Egyptians had started noticing things about cats that aligned eerily well with their religious beliefs. Cats were lineal creatures, active at dawn and dusk, moving between day and night. They could see in darkness when humans were blind. Their eyes seemed to glow within a fire. They were simultaneously gentle with their families and absolutely lethal to their prey. They killed snakes, including the venomous cobras that plagued Egyptian homes. Most importantly, female cats were extraordinarily devoted mothers, fiercely protective of their kittens. To a civilization obsessed with divine duality, the balance between creation and destruction, protection and power, cats seemed like perfect vessels for the sacred. And so they began their transformation, from useful animals to living gods. The goddess Bastet became the focal point of this transformation. Though her origins were more complex and darker than many people realize, she didn't start as a cat goddess at all. Originally, she was depicted as a lioness, one of several fierce feline deities representing the destructive power of the sun and the pharaoh's military might. In her earliest forms, Bastet was nearly indistinguishable from Sekhmet, the terrifying lion goddess who almost destroyed humanity in ancient myth. But sometime around 1000 BC, Bastet began to change. The fierce lioness softened into a domestic cat, or a woman with a cat's head. Her role shifted from divine warrior to protector of homes, guardian of pregnant women, goddess of fertility and domesticity. This transformation mirrored the cat's own evolution in Egyptian society, from wild predator to household guardian, from feared hunter to beloved companion. The change wasn't random. It reflected a fundamental shift in Egyptian culture. As the new kingdom gave way to later periods, Egypt became less focused on military conquest and more concerned with domestic prosperity. The gods adapted to match human needs. Bastet became the perfect deity for this new era. Powerful enough to protect, but gentle enough to love. Her worship centered on the city of Bastet in the Nile Delta, where a massive temple complex was dedicated to her honor. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus visited Bubastis around 450 BC and left us one of the most detailed descriptions we have of Egyptian cat worship. He wrote with barely concealed astonishment about the annual festival of Bastet, claiming it was the largest religious gathering in Egypt. According to his account, 700,000 people would travel to Bastet for the celebration, arriving by boat with musicians, dancers, and copious amounts of wine. The festival was raucous, joyful, more carnival than solemn ceremony. People drank, sang, made offerings, and celebrated the goddess who protected their homes and blessed them with children. But the most remarkable thing about Bastet's temple wasn't the festival. It was the cats. Hundreds, possibly thousands of cats lived in the temple complex, cared for by priests and priestesses who considered it their sacred duty. These weren't wild animals barely tolerating human presence. They were cats who'd been raised for generations in religious service, bred specifically to embody the goddess. Pilgrims brought offerings for them, special foods, toys, even jewelry. Some of these temple cats wore elaborate collars of gold and precious stones. When they died, they were mummified with the same care given to human nobility. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of Egyptian cat worship: the mummies, millions of them. In the late 1800s, when European archaeologists first started seriously excavating Egyptian animal cemeteries, they were unprepared for the sheer scale of what they found. One site alone, the cat cemetery at Bubastis, contained an estimated 300,000 mummified cats. Another site, near Beni Hassan, held hundreds of thousands more. The mummification wasn't crude or hasty. These cats were prepared using techniques similar to those used for human mummies, though less elaborate. Their internal organs were removed. Their bodies were treated with natron salt to preserve them. They were wrapped in linen, often with geometric patterns, and placed in specially made containers ranging from simple pottery jars to elaborate painted wooden coffins. Why so many? Partly because cats were genuinely beloved, and families wanted to ensure their pets would be with them in the afterlife, but also because a massive religious industry had developed around cat mummification. People who couldn't afford to mummify their own cats could purchase pre-mummified cats as offerings to Bast. Some were kittens raised specifically for this purpose, killed humanely, and prepared by temple priests. It's disturbing to modern sensibilities, but in the context of ancient Egyptian religion, it made perfect sense. You wanted to honor Bastet. You offered her the thing she loved most, a cat. The reverence for cats in daily life was equally intense. Egyptian law protected cats with penalties that seemed wildly disproportionate to anything we'd consider reasonable today. Several ancient sources claim that anyone who killed a cat, even accidentally, could face the death penalty. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, described witnessing a Roman visitor who accidentally killed a cat, being torn apart by an angry Egyptian mob, despite desperate attempts by Egyptian officials to save him. This might be exaggerated. The ancient historians loved a good dramatic story, but multiple sources mention similar incidents. The fear of harming cats was real and widespread. Archaeological evidence supports this. Egyptian artwork consistently shows cats in positions of comfort and privilege. Tomb paintings depict them sitting on cushioned chairs beneath their owners, ass seats at banquets, wearing jeweled collars, and eating from bowls. One famous painting shows a cat being fed by hand from a table laden with food while birds hang overhead, completely ignored because the cat is more important than maintaining the meat supply. These weren't working animals being given the bare minimum. They were family members being pampered. DNA evidence suggests something remarkable happened during this period. The cats living in Egypt around 1000 BC show genetic signatures of intensive breeding and selection. The Egyptians weren't just keeping whatever wild cats wandered into their grain stores anymore. They were actively breeding cats selecting for specific traits, probably temperament, cats friendly enough to live comfortably with humans, possibly appearance, though we can't be certain what traits they valued, but definitely breeding them systematically, creating the foundation for what would become the domestic cat as we know it today. The temple complexes became breeding centers, with hundreds of cats living in close proximity, cared for by humans. Genetic diversity would have narrowed quickly. Certain lineages would have dominated. This is exactly what we see in the genetic record. A bottleneck around 1000 BC in the feline lineage that gave rise to most modern domestic cats. Not a crisis bottleneck like the one that nearly destroyed humanity, but a breeding bottleneck, the signature of intentional selection by human breeders. But Egypt jealously guarded its sacred cats. Recognizing their value, both religious and practical, Egyptian authorities attempted to ban the export of cats from Egypt. Traders who dealt in cats faced severe penalties. The goal was to keep these divine animals exclusively Egyptian, maintaining a monopoly on both their practical benefits and their religious significance. It didn't work. Of course, it didn't work. Anytime a commodity becomes valuable and one group tries to monopolize it, smuggling becomes inevitable. Phoenician traders, notorious for moving anything profitable across the Mediterranean, started secretly transporting cats out of Egypt, hidden in cargo ships, concealed among other goods, probably breeding them on ships during long voyages. Greek merchants did the same. Roman traders followed. By 500 BC, cats that were almost certainly descended from Egyptian stock were appearing in Greece, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean coast. The Egyptian religious monopoly on cats was breaking down. But in Egypt itself, the worship continued. Bastet remained one of the most popular deities right through the TMIC period. Even as Greek culture mixed with Egyptian traditions after Alexander's conquest, the temple at Bubastix continued operating. The temples still came for the festivals. Cats were still mummified by the thousands. Then Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, and everything changed. Not immediately. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions in their conquered territories, but they didn't share the Egyptian reverence for cats. To Roman sensibilities, the Egyptian obsession with felines seemed bizarre, possibly even ridiculous. They had their own sacred animals, and cats weren't among them. More importantly, Roman pragmatism clashed with Egyptian divine economics. The massive temple complexes with their thousands of priests caring for thousands of cats, all supported by tax revenues and donations, struck Roman administrators as wasteful. Over the next few centuries, funding for the temple complexes was gradually reduced. Priests moved to other occupations. The great festivals became smaller, less frequent, finally disappearing altogether. The cat cemeteries fell into disuse. By 400 AD, the worship of Bastet had essentially ended, suppressed partly by Roman practicality, and finally killed off by the rise of Christianity, which had no patience for animal worship of any kind. But the cats themselves survived. Centuries of breeding and selection had created an animal perfectly adapted to life alongside humans. They'd spread across the Mediterranean world. They'd lost their divinity, but they'd gained something equally valuable: ubiquity. The Egyptian experiment in cat worship was over. But the partnership between cats and humans, refined and intensified along the Nile, would continue spreading across the globe. The descendants of Bastet's sacred hunters were about to conquer the world. The Phoenicians didn't set out to change the world when they smuggled cats out of Egypt. They were just solving a problem. Grain shipments across the Mediterranean were being destroyed by rats and mice. Simple economics. A cargo ship could carry enough wheat to feed a city for weeks. But if rodents got into the hold during a 3-week voyage, you'd arrive with half your profit eaten and the rest contaminated with droppings. The Phoenicians needed a solution, and they found one padding around the docks of Egyptian ports. Egyptian law technically prohibited the export of cats. They were sacred animals, property of the goddess Bastet, not commodities for foreign trade. But laws only work if you can enforce them. And the Mediterranean is a big place, with a lot of coastline. Phoenician traders began acquiring cats, probably through a combination of theft, bribery, and strategic breeding of cats that had wandered away from Egyptian control. Within a few generations, Phoenician ships sailing out of Tyre and Sidon carried a secret weapon in their holds. Small, efficient, tireless hunters that worked for nothing more than the rats they caught. This was the first great feline diaspora. Not a planned colonization, not a deliberate introduction, but a practical necessity that happened to change the course of history. Every Phoenician trading post from Gibraltar to Carthage, from Sicily to the Levantine coast, every warehouse and granary that stored their goods became a potential cat habitat. And cats, being cats, didn't stay in the warehouses. They wandered into cities, bred in alleyways, and gradually became part of the urban ecosystem across the Mediterranean world. But this wasn't a rapid conquest. We're talking about centuries, maybe close to 1,000 years, for cats to spread from Egyptian exclusivity to Mediterranean commonality. The timeline was slow because cats faced competition. Other animals had already filled the rodent control niche in most places, and they'd been doing it for a long time. In ancient Greece, cats were curiosities, not commonplace. If you were walking through Athens in the 5th century BC, you probably wouldn't see any cats. Maybe one or two kept by wealthy merchants with Mediterranean trading connections, displayed like exotic pets. The Greeks had ferrets. They domesticated them centuries earlier, trained them to hunt rats in grain stores and snakes in gardens. Ferrets were smaller, more easily controlled, and they had been part of Greek culture long enough to appear in artwork and literature. Weasels were even more common, semi-wild animals that people tolerated and sometimes encouraged around their properties because they killed rodents and snakes. So when cats started appearing in Greek ports brought by Phoenician and later Roman traders, they weren't immediately embraced. They were foreign, associated with Egypt and its strange animal-worshipping religion, and they didn't do anything a good ferret couldn't do better, or so the Greeks thought. But cats had advantages that became apparent over time. Ferrets needed cages, training, careful handling. Weasels were unpredictable, sometimes killing chickens or attacking small pets. Cats, remarkably, managed themselves. Feed them occasionally, and they'd stick around. Ignore them completely, and they'd still control your rodent problem. They were low-maintenance solutions to a persistent issue. Gradually, over centuries, Greek attitude shifted. By the Hellenistic period, cats were appearing in Greek art, usually in domestic scenes, sometimes playing with balls of yarn or being fed by women and children. They still weren't ubiquitous, but they transitioned from exotic novelties to accepted, if not beloved, household animals. The Romans were more pragmatic about cats from the start. They appreciated efficiency, and cats were efficient. Roman granaries, the massive warehouses that stored grain for the empire's armies and cities, had serious rodent problems. Rats and mice could destroy enough grain in a single warehouse to feed a legion for months. The Romans tried everything. Architectural solutions like raised floors and smooth walls, chemical deterrents, traps, even professional rat catchers with dogs and clubs. Nothing worked as well as cats. So the Romans bred them, transported them, established them in every major granary, from Britannia to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria. Military camps kept cats for the same reason. An army travels on its stomach, and an army supplies travel in wagons vulnerable to rodent infestation. Cats became part of military logistics, unofficial members of the legion who earned their keep by protecting food supplies. But something else happened in Rome, something that hadn't quite occurred in Greece. Some Romans started to like cats, not just appreciate their utility, but actually enjoy their company. We have Roman mosaics showing cats in comfortable domestic settings, not working in granaries, but lounging in villas, being offered food by hand. We have Roman grave markers for pet cats inscribed with affectionate epitaphs mourning their loss. This wasn't universal. Roman culture never embraced cats the way Egypt had, but it was real. For the first time outside Egypt, cats were transitioning from working animals to companions. While cats were establishing themselves around the Mediterranean, other populations were traveling east along the Silk Road. This wasn't a single road, of course, but a network of trade routes connecting the Roman Empire with Central Asia, India, and eventually China. Merchants traveling these routes faced the same problems as maritime traders, valuable goods vulnerable to rodent damage during long, slow journeys across deserts and mountains. Cats provided the same solution. The journey was harder than the Mediterranean spread. Silk Road routes passed through environments cats hadn't evolved for. High-altitude mountain passes with thin, cold air, deserts where water was scarce, and prey animals were few. But cats are remarkably adaptable, and they had help. Merchants who'd invested in cats for their caravans had incentive to keep them alive. The cats that survived the journey were the toughest, the most adaptable, the ones with genetic variations that helped them handle environmental stress. Over centuries, cat populations established themselves in trading cities along the Silk Road. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, cities where east met west, and goods from 3 continents changed hands. Each city became a hub for local cat populations, breeding and adapting to local conditions, then spreading further as merchants moved on. India received cats from multiple directions. Some came overland through Central Asia, traveling with merchants and settling in northern cities. Others arrived by sea, carried on ships trading between Roman Egypt and Indian ports on the western coast. The timeline is murky. We don't have precise dates for when cats first established populations in India, but genetic evidence suggests it happened somewhere between 2000 and 1500 years ago. Hindu culture had complicated relationships with animals, and cats fit uneasily into existing frameworks. They weren't sacred like cows or elephants. They weren't clearly beneficial like horses or oxmen. They occupied an ambiguous space useful for rodent control, but associated with independence and nocturnal hunting that made them seem mysterious, potentially dangerous. Some Hindu texts mention cats negatively, as symbols of deceit or ingratitude. Others treat them neutrally, as ordinary animals without particular spiritual significance. This ambivalence would persist for centuries. Cats in India remained working animals. Tolerated but rarely beloved, China received cats even later than India, probably not establishing significant populations until around 1,500 years ago. This seems odd. China had sophisticated agriculture, dense urban populations, and serious rodent problems. Why did it take so long for cats to arrive? The answer is probably competition. China had already domesticated other animals for rodent control, particularly certain breeds of small dogs, and more successfully various species of snakes that people encouraged around granaries and homes. Cats had to offer something these established solutions didn't. What they offered was companionship. Chinese culture, particularly among the educated elite, valued refinement, elegance, aesthetic appreciation. Cats, with their graceful movements, fastidious grooming, and quiet dignity, appealed to these values in ways snakes and ratting dogs didn't. By the Tang dynasty, cats were appearing in Chinese poetry and art, not just as working animals, but as objects of aesthetic contemplation. This was a different kind of acceptance than cats had found in Rome or Greece, based less on practical utility and more on cultural appreciation of their intrinsic qualities. But the most remarkable cat introduction happened at the far edge of the ancient trading world, Japan. The Japanese islands were isolated, separated from the Asian mainland by enough ocean that most animals couldn't reach them naturally. Cats certainly couldn't. They had to be deliberately transported by ship, and that didn't happen until surprisingly late, probably not until around 1,200 years ago. When cats finally arrived in Japan, they came as elite imports. The early cats were gifts to the imperial court, exotic animals from China presented as tribute. The emperor kept them as palace pets, rare and precious. For generations, cats in Japan remained associated with aristocracy, animals too valuable to let roam freely. They were kept indoors, sometimes on leashes, protected and pampered. This artificial scarcity created cultural associations that would persist even after cats became common. In Japanese culture, cats retained an air of refinement and mystery, creatures that had once belonged only to emperors. But underlying all these cultural stories, all these regional variations in how different societies received and perceived cats, was a more fundamental story, the story of ship cats. the unsung heroes of maritime trade who made the entire feline diaspora possible. Every cat population outside Egypt ultimately descended from cats that had survived sea voyages. And surviving at sea wasn't easy. Ships were dangerous environments. Storms could wash animals overboard. Disease spread quickly in confined spaces. Food and fresh water were limited. But ships also had something cats desperately needed: rats. Massive populations of rats that bred in the holds, nested in the cargo, and spread disease throughout the crew. A good ship's cat could make the difference between a profitable voyage and a disaster. Merchants knew this. Captains knew this, and they selected for it. The cats that became ancestral to worldwide populations were the ones that could survive storms, tolerate weeks at sea without fresh water, hunt effectively in dark, confined spaces, and coexist with humans in extremely close quarters. These weren't typical cats. They were specialists, bred and selected for maritime life over hundreds of generations, and their descendants spreading from port to port carried those adaptations with them. The cats that eventually colonized the entire world were already adapted to travel to strange environments, to making themselves useful to humans in challenging conditions. They were, in a sense, pre-adapted for global conquest before the conquest even began. By the early medieval period, maybe 1,500 years ago, cats had established populations across most of the known world. From Britain to Japan, from Scandinavia to India, cats were present in most major cities and many rural areas. They weren't equally common everywhere. Some regions still preferred other solutions to rodent problems, but they were available, established, ready for the next chapter in their history. A chapter that would nearly destroy them entirely. Picture a monastery in early medieval France, maybe around 700 CE. Dawn is breaking over stone walls that have stood for generations. In the grain storage rooms, a tabby cat pads silently between sacks of wheat, ears pricked forward, waiting. A mouse emerges. The cat pounces, one less threat to the monastery's winter food supply. The monks who passed by nod approvingly. This cat is doing God's work, protecting the harvest from vermin. For the first few centuries of medieval Europe, this was the normal relationship between cats and humans. Practical, valued, unremarkable. Cats lived in monasteries, on farms, in the homes of merchants, nobles. They weren't particularly beloved, not like they had been in ancient Egypt, but they were useful. That was enough. The Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, didn't specifically mention cats, but monastic records from across Europe show they were common residents of religious houses. Cats in the scriptorum, keeping mice away from precious manuscripts. Cats in the kitchen, protecting food stores. Cats in the barns, earning their keep with every rat they caught. Some monasteries even kept official records of their cat populations, listing them alongside livestock and other valuable property. In the Islamic world, this practical appreciation deepened into genuine reverence. The Prophet Muhammad was said to have loved his cat Mosa so much that when the call to prayer came, and Mosa was sleeping on the sleeve of his robe, Muhammad cut off the sleeve, rather than disturb the cat. Whether historically accurate or not, this story shaped Islamic attitudes toward cats for over 1,000 years. In medieval Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, cats wandered freely through mosques and markets, protected by religious law and cultural tradition. Stray cats were fed by charitable foundations. Harming a cat could bring serious social consequences. But in Christian Europe, something was shifting. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but gathering momentum like a storm building on the horizon. The change had roots in theology, in politics, in the peculiar anxieties of medieval Christianity. The early church fathers had been ambivalent about animals in general. Creatures served humanity, yes, but they could also represent temptation, sin, the base instincts that drew humans away from spiritual purity. As Christianity consolidated its power across Europe, this suspicion of the natural world intensified. Anything wild, anything that couldn't be fully controlled or understood, became potentially dangerous, potentially demonic. Cats occupied a strange position in this worldview. They were domesticated, yes, but not really tame. Not like dogs who showed obvious loyalty and obedience. Cats came and went as they pleased. They hunted at night, moved silently, appeared and disappeared like shadows. Their eyes reflected light in the darkness, glowing with an eerie green or gold luminescence that seemed unnatural, even supernatural, and they were associated with women, with the domestic sphere that the Church was increasingly trying to regulate and control. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the first hints of something darker began appearing in religious texts and popular folklore. Stories about witches who could transform into cats, tales of demons who took feline form to tempt the faithful. Nothing systematic yet, just scattered references, but the foundation was being laid. Then came 1233. Pope Gregory I IX issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama. The document was primarily about combating heresy in Germany, but it included a detail that would echo through the centuries. Gregory described a heretical ritual in which worshippers allegedly encountered Satan in the form of a cat, specifically a black cat, or a cat with dark spots. They would kiss this demonic cat and pledge their souls to darkness. Whether such rituals ever actually occurred is doubtful. Most historians now think these accounts were propaganda designed to justify the persecution of religious minorities and political enemies. But the papal bull gave official church sanction to the idea that cats, particularly black cats, were connected to devil worship. And once that seed was planted in the medieval imagination, it grew like poison ivy. The association spread, not everywhere at once, not uniformly, but steadily across Europe through the 13th and 14th centuries. Black cats especially became objects of suspicion. Their dark fur seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They blended perfectly into shadows. When they appeared suddenly from darkness, it could startle even the bravest soul. In an age without street lighting, when night was truly dark and full of real dangers, the sudden appearance of glowing eyes in the blackness must have been genuinely terrifying. Superstitions multiplied. A black cat crossing your path meant bad luck. A cat at a funeral meant the deceased soul was in danger. Cats seen near a sick person was stealing their breath, their life force. These beliefs varied by region and social class, but they shared a common theme. Cats were no longer just animals. They were portents, omens, potentially demonic agents operating in the mortal world. Then came the witch trials. Starting in the 15th century and accelerating through the 16th and 17th, a wave of paranoia swept across Europe. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft. And cats, particularly black cats, became central to these accusations. The logic, if you can call it that, went like this. Witches received their power from Satan. To maintain contact with their demonic master, each witch was given a familiar, a spirit in animal form, who would serve them and keep them connected to the dark powers. These familiars most often appeared as cats. The trial records are horrifying. Women accused of witchcraft were asked about their cats. Did they talk to them? Did the cats behave strangely? Did they have unusual markings? Any affection for a cat could be used as evidence of witchcraft. Any cat that lived in an accused witch's home was itself put on trial, and the cats suffered alongside their human companions. When a woman was condemned, her cats were often killed with her, thrown into the flames during burnings, drowned, beaten to death by mobs convinced they were destroying demonic servants. In some towns, cat torture became a form of entertainment. Cats thrown from towers, sealed in barrels, and set ablaze, killed in public spectacles that drew cheering crowds. The persecution wasn't universal. It was most intense in areas where witch trial fervor ran highest. Parts of Germany, France, Scotland, England. It waxed and waned over decades and centuries. But for roughly 300 years, from the late 1400s to the early 1700s, being a cat in many parts of Europe was genuinely dangerous. And being a black cat could be a death sentence. Some historians have suggested a grim irony here. During this same period, Europe was ravaged by plague. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. Subsequent outbreaks continued for centuries, and the plague was spread primarily by rats. Rats carrying infected fleas that jumped to humans, spreading the bacterium that caused the disease. The theory goes like this. By killing cats, medieval Europeans eliminated their best defense against rodent populations. With fewer cats hunting them, rat populations exploded. More rats meant more fleas, more disease vectors, potentially worse plague outbreaks. Could the superstitious persecution of cats have actually worsened one of history's greatest pandemics? It's an appealing narrative, and there might be some truth to it, but like many historical explanations, it's probably oversimplified. Plague transmission is complex, affected by climate, population density, sanitation practices, and dozens of other factors. Cat populations did decline in some areas, but probably not uniformly or dramatically enough to single-handedly worsen the plague. And some regions with intense cat persecution weren't hit harder by plague than regions where cats remained common. Still, the parallel is striking. At the exact historical moment when cats could have been most valuable to human survival, superstition drove many people to destroy them. It's a reminder of how dangerous unfounded beliefs can be, how fear and ignorance can convince people to act against their own interests. But even during the darkest periods, practical necessity often trumped superstition. Farmers still needed cats to protect grain stores. Millers needed them to keep rats away from flour. Ship captains, even in the age of witch trials, still brought cats aboard to control rodent populations on long voyages. These practical cats continued their work, often quietly without much acknowledgement, but also without persecution. And in the Islamic world, cats remained beloved. While European witch hunters were throwing cats into fires, cats in Cairo were being fed from charitable endowments. While Scottish ministers preached about demonic familiars, cats in Damascus were napping peacefully in mosque courtyards. The contrast couldn't be starker. Same animal, same historical period, radically different treatment based on nothing more than cultural beliefs. Some individual Europeans spoke out against the persecution. The 16th-century writer, Ulysses Dravandi, argued that cats were beneficial animals who deserved protection, not persecution. A few voices within the church questioned whether the witch trial hysteria had gone too far, though usually cautiously, and without specifically defending cats, but these were minority. Opinions easily drowned out by the dominant narrative of suspicion and fear. By the late 17th century, the worst was ending. Witch trials were becoming less common, increasingly questioned by Enlightenment thinkers who demanded evidence and reason rather than superstition. The scientific revolution was changing how educated Europeans thought about the natural world, and practical experience was slowly teaching people what Islamic cultures and ancient Egyptians had always known. Cats were valuable allies, not demonic enemies, but the damage had been done. Centuries of persecution had embedded anti-cat superstitions deep in European folklore. Even today, many people consider black cats unlucky, avoid them on the street, hesitate to adopt them from shelters. These are echoes of medieval fears, prejudices that outlive the specific circumstances that created them. The cats themselves, of course, survived. They always do. Through persecution and plague, through fire and fear, through centuries when humans seemed determined to destroy them, cats endured. They kept hunting, kept surviving, kept living alongside humans, whether humans appreciated them or not. They were waiting, patient as always, for the world to come to its senses and remember what they had always been. Not demons, or omens, or familiars, but simply cats, hunters, survivors, silent witnesses to human folly, waiting for sanity to return. And eventually, slowly, sanity did return. By the late Middle Ages, the worst was over. But the cats didn't know that yet. For centuries, they had been walking bad omens in much of Europe, shadows with whiskers, living suspects in every unexplained illness, every sour batch of beer, every barn fire that started for no reason. But something was beginning to change slowly, unevenly, like dawn light leaking around the edges of a shuttered window. The bonfires were dying down. Witch trials didn't end overnight. They never do. In some regions, they fizzled out early. In others, they flared well into the 17th century. But the direction of history was turning. Skeptical judges began asking awkward questions. Royal courts grew embarrassed by stories of grandmothers burned for talking to a stray cat. Basic social psychology tells us you can't keep the whole population terrified forever. Fear eventually runs out of fuel. The Black Death receded. Plague became less frequent, more manageable. People no longer saw every misfortune as a personal curse. And as the terror ebbed, the link between old woman plus cat equals witch began to feel a little childish. Slowly, the neighbors stopped pointing at the cat on the windowsill. At first, cats simply faded back into the background. Barns still needed rodent control. Ships still needed mouses. Grain still needed protection. Even the most superstitious farmer could see the very practical difference between a barn with cats and a barn without them. One had rats, the other had food. In many villages, cats stayed quietly useful while human ideas shifted around them. Witch hunters grew old and died. Their grandchildren went to new schools, read new books, heard new sermons that talked less about demons and more about God's ordered creation. Theater troupes staged comedies that gently mocked overzealous witch-finders. What had once been deadly serious became faintly ridiculous. The cat never argued theology. It just kept catching mice. And yet, in a few special places, cats weren't just surviving. They were being adored. In 17th century France, inside walls thick enough to mute the chaos of the outside world, Cardinal Richelieu was building an empire and a cattery. Richelieu, the powerful statesman behind Louis XIII, might be one of history's first famous cat collectors. While he schemed over alliances and wars, he lived surrounded by cats. Not one or two, dozens. He had special rooms set aside for them in his residence. Servants were reportedly assigned to their care. Food, cushions, sleeping places, planned, organized, maintained. Imagine the contrast. Outside, rumors of witchcraft could still get you in trouble. Inside, one of Europe's most feared politicians was spending quiet evenings with a lap full of purring animals. There are stories, part fact, part legend, of Richelieu, including instructions for his cats in his will, making sure they would be cared for after his death. Whether every detail is true or not, almost doesn't matter. The image is powerful. A prince of the church, not casting out cats as demons, but treating them as cherished companions. That kind of endorsement seeps outward. Courtiers talk, visitors notice, imitators copy. Cats were being rehabilitated from the top down. At the same time, painters across Europe were doing their own kind of rescue mission, one brushstroke at a time. In Renaissance and Baroque art, cats slipped into the corners of canvases like quiet witnesses. Sometimes they crouched under the table in a domestic scene, eyes following a piece of dropped bread. Sometimes they curled at the feet of a woman reading. Sometimes in religious paintings, they lurked on the margins, symbols whose meaning changed with the painter and the patron. To viewers of the time, a cat in a painting wasn't neutral. It was a sign. In some works, especially early on, cats represented treachery, sensuality, or uncontrolled instinct, the opposite of discipline and piety. A cat near Judas might signal betrayal. A cat approaching a bird might stand for sin stalking innocence. Old symbolic traditions die slowly, but the Renaissance brought a new fascination with daily life. Painters liked to show what people actually saw at home. Children playing, bread being cut, dogs and cats sharing the same hearth. And the more cats appeared in ordinary tender scenes curled at the foot of a bed playing with a child's toy, the harder it became to believe they were emissaries of hell. In Dutch Golden Age paintings, you can almost feel the fur, the soft half-sleeping cat in a shaft of window light, the mischievous paw reaching for a fish on the table. These aren't demons. They are household members. Slightly naughty, thoroughly alive, absolutely real. Art was giving cats something they hadn't had in Europe for a long time: emotional depth. Meanwhile, another quiet revolution was beginning. Not in churches or palaces, but in laboratories, observatories, and the notebooks of curious minds. The scientific revolution from the 16th to the 18th centuries changed how Europeans thought about everything: stars, planets, diseases, and eventually animals. Superstition and folklore didn't vanish, but they had a new competitor: curiosity. Instead of asking, "Is this cat a witch's familiar?" some scholars began asking, "What is this creature? How does it see in the dark? Why does it land on its feet?" Naturalists started drawing animals not as symbols but as specimens. They sketched cat skeletons to understand anatomy. They dissected eyes to study vision. They compared domestic cats to wild ones, trying to map relationships. The cat, once wrapped in layers of myth, was becoming an object of observation. This didn't mean people suddenly became kind. Vivisection and brutal experiments were common. But it did mean that fear could be replaced by explanation. If a cat's eyes shone at night, you no longer needed a devil to account for it. You could talk about light reflecting from the tapetum lucidum, even if you didn't yet have that name for it. Step by step, the unexplained was shrinking, and with it, one of the main fuels for persecution. By the 18th century, in the Age of Enlightenment, cats had quietly crept into the salons. Philosophers, writers, and intellectuals, especially in France and Britain, began to keep cats as companions. For some, it was practical. Cats kept manuscripts free of nibbling mice. For others, it was emotional. Late nights spent reading and writing felt less lonely with a warm body on the desk. Voltaire reportedly disliked dogs but tolerated cats. Jean-Jacques Rousseau Denis and others wrote about animals as feeling beings capable of pleasure and pain. That idea that animals had inner lives, however different from ours, changed the moral landscape. Writers shaped the myth of the cat into something new, independent, aloof, philosophical. A creature that would sit by the fire, half in the human world, half in its own private universe. Perfect company for thinkers who prided themselves on standing apart from the crowd. In letters and essays, Enlightenment figures sometimes contrasted cats with humans. People, they suggested, were eager for approval and power. Cats, they seemed content with sunbeams and comfort, a different kind of wisdom, a subtle rebuke to human vanity. The cat was becoming, in some circles, a symbol of quiet skepticism, not demonic, not saintly, just unbothered. Then came the French Revolution, and with it, a new kind of symbolism. Revolutionary imagery is full of lions, roosters, eagles, bold, noisy animals ready to roar or crow for liberty. But in the shadows, in pamphlets, stories, and small artworks, cats sometimes appeared as symbols of something else: personal independence. While great armies marched and heads fell, ordinary people still lived in cramped apartments and back alleys. For them, freedom was not just about constitutions and assemblies. It was about the ability to shut a door, light a candle, read a banned book with a cat asleep on the bed. In some revolutionary and post-revolutionary imagery, cats represented the stubborn refusal to be owned in spirit, even when your body was still poor and your work hard. A creature that chose when to come and go, that could not be easily trained to salute any flag. In crowded Paris, stray cats threaded through the chaos. They walked under posters of new governments, between the boots of soldiers, past the feet of starving crowds. Regimes rose and fell. The cats stayed. Slowly, in the decades after the revolution, as Europe lurched through new wars and new empires, cats found a more stable status. Ordinary companions for ordinary people. Not sacred, not cursed, just there, on windowsills, rooftops, stairwells, familiar. And as the 19th century dawned, a new phenomenon began to emerge. People didn't just want cats. They wanted particular kinds of cats. Long before the Victorians turned cat breeding into a full-blown obsession, you can see hints of cat fancy appearing. Wealthy households prized unusual coats, long hair, odd colors, striking patterns. Travelers wrote home about strange silky cats in Persia, tailless cats on distant islands, sleek, elegant mouses in eastern ports. Small, informal exhibitions began to appear at fairs and markets. A farmer might boast about his best ratter. A merchant might bring a curious long-haired cat to show friends. No official judges, no trophies, just the first stirrings of an idea that a cat could be admired not only for its usefulness, but for its beauty. These early shows were scattered, sometimes barely recorded, but they set the stage for what would come later in Victorian England. Organized cat shows, breed standards, pedigrees, the transformation of the cat from anonymous mouser to recognized individual. While all this was unfolding in European cities and salons, cats themselves were traveling farther than ever before. The age of exploration, which had started centuries earlier, was still sending ships to every edge of the world. And on almost every vessel, as quietly constant as the creak of the masts, there were cats, explorers heading to the Americas, merchants sailing around Africa, convicts transported to Australia. All shared their cramped quarters with felines. The logic was simple. Ships full of grain, cloth, and food were paradise for rats. Rats were disaster for sailors. Cats were the solution. So they went along across the Atlantic to Caribbean harbors and the eastern seaboard of North America, around the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, onto India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, across the Pacific to the coast of the Americas, from the other side down into the southern oceans toward Australia and New Zealand. At each stop, some cats stayed behind, jumping ship, getting lost, being gifted or traded, or simply walking away when the gangplank dropped. They mated with local wildcats where those existed, or with other strays that had arrived on earlier ships. New populations formed, adapted, and spread on isolated islands. These introductions would have devastating effects on native wildlife, something people wouldn't fully understand until much later. But from the cat's perspective, the world was opening. A species that had once lived mostly in the Near East and parts of Africa now lived on almost every continent, on remote islands, in tropical ports and cold northern towns. From Renaissance galleons to revolutionary gunboats, they had ridden human ambition across the globe. By the early 19th century, as steam engines began to replace sails and factories replaced workshops, the long rehabilitation of the cat was almost complete. They had gone from sacred hunters of the Nile to whispered demons of the medieval night, from the cherished pets of cardinals to the favored companions of philosophers, from anonymous ships, mouses, to exotic curiosities at early fairs. They had followed us through religious upheavals, scientific revolutions, and political storms. Never in charge, never truly equal, but always present, watching with lamplit eyes as our ideas about them and about ourselves shifted. The stage was now set for their next transformation. The Victorian era was coming, and in that age of industry and sentiment of classification and comfort, the cat was about to step fully into the role we recognize today. The modern house cat, named, photographed, written about, and more than ever before, loved. The industrial ages arrived, soot and steam and telegraph wires stretching across the sky. Trains scream through the countryside. Factories belch smoke all night. Gas lamps turn darkness into a dull yellow haze, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise and progress, a small, soft animal is quietly reinventing itself. The cat is moving indoors. For thousands of years, cats had been workers first and companions second. Ships, hunters, barn guardians, alleyway shadows. They were useful, practical, affordable pest control with whiskers. People might have loved them, but society didn't really have a formal place for that love. The Victorian era changed that. It began, as many Victorian things did, with classification, with taking something messy and organic and turning it into categories, charts, and competitions. Picture London, 1871. The Crystal Palace, an enormous glass cathedral of industry and exhibition, iron ribs arching over thousands of visitors. This was where the world came to display its wonders, machines, inventions, exotic plants, human curiosities, and on one particular summer day, cats. Not alley cats slinking through the crowds, not half-wild mouses lurking in the rafters, but cats in cages, arranged in neat rows, watched, judged, admired. At the center of it all stood a man named Harrison Weir, an illustrator, animal lover, and passionate organizer. He believed cats deserved the same attention that dogs and horses were beginning to receive: formal shows, written standards, recognition. So he did something that at the time seemed almost absurd. He held a beauty pageant for cats. They came by the dozens. Long-haired Persians, then often called Angoras, sleek short-haired tabbies, their stripes like poured smoke. Cats with unusual colors, unusual patterns, unusual faces. The catalogue divided them into classes by sex, by coat length, by color. For the first time, cats were being publicly evaluated not for how many mice they could kill, but for how they looked. Visitors streamed past the cages, whispering, pointing. Some scoffed, some laughed, some were enchanted. Newspapers reported on the event with a mix of amusement and fascination. But something important had happened. The Crystal Palace Cat Show of 1871 turned an invisible household worker into a visible object of admiration. It took the cat out of the shadows and placed it under the glass roof of modernity, right alongside steam engines and scientific instruments. From that moment, the modern house cat began to take shape. Victorians loved categories. They loved to divide, list, describe, and control. Plants, skull shapes, social classes, everything could be sorted into neat slots. Cats were no exception. Up to this point, a cat was just a cat. Maybe you'd say tabby or tortoiseshell, black or white. But these were loose descriptors, not formal types. There were local variations, of course. Fuzzier cats in colder regions, sleek desert mouses in warmer ones. But no one had yet decided that those variations should become breeds. Victorian breeders did. They began with what they could see: coat length, color, pattern, face shape. A long-haired cat from the east was labeled Persian. A blue-grey short-haired cat from Britain was gathered into the emerging concept of the British. Short hair. Unusual colors, solid blacks, striking whites. Rare oranges were singled out and bred together. Selective breeding, which had already transformed wolves into dozens of dog breeds and reshaped farm animals for centuries, was now being turned on the domestic cat. At first, it was clumsy. Standards were vague, records incomplete. But slowly, a pattern emerged. Fanciers like Harrison Weir began to write explicit descriptions. The ideal head shape, the proper eye color, the correct length and texture of fur. A good Persian was not just any long-haired cat. It was one that matched a carefully drafted image in a breeder's mind. Of course, the cats had no idea. All they knew was that suddenly some of them were being chosen not for their hunting skills, but for their fluff, for the roundness of their cheeks, for the way their eyes contrasted with their fur. In the quiet of Victorian parlors and drawing rooms, humans were reimagining what a cat could be. At the same time, something even more radical was happening slowly, household by household. The cat was leaving the barn and entering the living room. Industrialization had changed how people lived in cities. The middle class was growing. Families moved into terrace houses and apartment blocks, places with no granaries, no haylofts, no great stores of grain, fewer rats, fewer mice, more carpets and upholstered chairs. In these spaces, a cat could no longer be just a mouser. It had to be appropriate. Victorian morality prized order, cleanliness, control. The home was meant to be a sanctuary from the chaos of the streets. To let a half-wild, soot-covered alley cat roam the parlor, unthinkable, but a well-groomed, carefully chosen, politely mannered cat. That could work. Writers and etiquette guides began to speak of cats as suitable companions, especially for women and children. Gentle, quiet, self-contained. Unlike dogs, which demanded walks and rough play, cats could fit the slower rhythms of domestic life. They could sit on a cushion, curl up in a lap, pose decoratively on a windowsill. Middle-class homes began to treat cats less as tools and more as family members. They were given names more often, not just Puss or Tom, but real human names. Their temperaments were noticed, their quirks indulged. This shift wasn't universal. Many cats were still working animals in stables and warehouses, but in the expanding world of respectable Victorian homes, a new archetype was crystallizing: the house cat as a proper pet. With that came a second, quieter revolution. People started to worry about their welfare. The 19th century saw the birth of organized animal protection movements. Horses overworked and beaten on city streets drew much of the early attention. But slowly, cats so often neglected, abandoned, or casually abused, entered the conversation. Charities and societies formed to rescue strays, often linked to the broader humane movement that had already produced the first laws against animal cruelty. Shelters began to appear. Leaflets were printed, urging kindness to the humble cat, reminding readers that these animals felt pain, fear, and affection. Some Victorians campaigned specifically against the casual killing of unwanted kittens, a common practice in an age before spaying and neutering were widely accepted. Others protested the use of cats in scientific experiments, an early forerunner of anti-vivisection activism. For the first time in history, there were organized voices speaking not just for valuable racehorse horses or hunting dogs, but for ordinary cats. The idea that society owed them a measure of protection was beginning to take root. Of course, ideas spread fastest when the powerful and famous embraced them, and the Victorian era had no shortage of notable cat lovers. Queen Victoria herself kept cats and spoke fondly of them. Her approval mattered. When the monarch was known to favor a species, that species' social standing rose. To own and cherish a cat became a bit more acceptable, a bit more respectable. Writers, too, put their reputations behind feline affection. Charles Dickens, chronicler of London streets and its hidden sorrows, kept cats that wandered across his manuscripts and into his personal myths. One of his cats, when it died, supposedly had its paw turned into a letter opener, morbid by modern standards, but also a kind of homage, a way of keeping the animal present in his daily life. Across the Atlantic, but still very much a man of the Victorian age, Mark Twain adored cats. He lived with many at once, gave them elaborate names, and wrote affectionately about their intelligence and independence. His public persona as a witty, skeptical observer of human nature made his cat love influential. If Mark Twain thought cats were remarkable, perhaps they were. These high-profile humans didn't just keep cats, they talked about them, wrote about them, posed with them. Each anecdote, each story, helped shift public imagination. The cat stopped being an anonymous background figure and started becoming a character. As cats move closer to the human hearth, something else had to change: how they were cared for on a daily basis. For most of history, a cat fed itself. It hunted. It scavenged scraps. It ate what it could when it could. Humans might toss it leftovers, but there was no concept of cat food. The Victorian period didn't yet have the modern kibble and canned meals that would flood the 20th century, but the groundwork was being laid. Commercial dog foods appeared first. Pressed biscuits marketed to urban dog owners who no longer had easy access to slaughterhouse, waste or farm-off cuts. Soon, enterprising manufacturers realized there was a smaller, wait-in. People who wanted specialized food for their cats. Early cat foods were primitive by modern nutritional standards, often just adaptations of dog biscuits or meat scraps, preserved in new industrial ways. They weren't universal or even common, but they introduced an idea that cats might have their own dietary needs distinct from humans and dogs. Litter, as we know it today, wouldn't be invented until the mid-20th century, but Victorians were already improvising indoor solutions. A truly indoor cat needed somewhere to relieve itself when the streets were muddy, crowded, or unsafe. Sandboxes, ashtrays, piles of soil in a corner, all crude ancestors of what would become commercial cat litter. The principle was emerging. Cats could be fully indoor animals, their needs managed within the home. Alongside food and primitive facilities came other products: collars, decorative bells, grooming tools. Each new object tightened the bond between cat and owner, turning care into a routine, and routine into relationship. Culture, as always, followed close behind. Victorian literature and art were full of symbolism, allegory, and moral lessons. Cats, with their elusive nature and nocturnal habits, fit easily into that symbolic world. They appeared in children's stories as sly tricksters or loyal companions. In illustrations, they curled on hearth rugs, perched on bookcases, peered out from behind lace curtains. Painters captured them in domestic scenes, A child asleep with a cat at their feet. An old woman knitting while a cat watches the fire. These images helped fix the animal in the public imagination as part of the ideal home. Warmth, safety, continuity, a soft living presence amidst the hardness of industrial life. Even when cats appeared as witches, familiars, or symbols of mystery, they were now clearly domestic cats, not wild spirits from the fields. Their world was fireplaces and staircases, not forests and deserts. Behind the scenes of all this cultural attention, another quiet bureaucracy was forming. Cat registries. If you want breeds, you need records. If you want records, you need organizations. And if you want organizations, you need rules. Cat clubs formed at first small and local, then national. They kept stud books, written registers of cats' parentage. Breeders sent in names, lineages, descriptions. Over time, these scattered notes grew into formal pedigrees, multi-generation charts showing exactly who begat whom. This might seem like dry paperwork, but it did something profound. It turned certain cats into documented individuals with official identities that extended beyond their own lifetimes. A particular Tom or Queen could now influence the look and temperament of future generations, even long after they were gone, because their names on paper guided breeding decisions. In the language of genetics, this was a new kind of selection pressure layered on top of the old ones. In the language of history, it was the moment when the cat ceased to be purely a product of natural and informal human selection and became an object of deliberate design. By the end of the Victorian era, the transformation was well underway. The cat had stepped out of the barn and into the parlor. It had been measured, classified, bred, and adored. Its suffering had begun to matter to strangers. Its image appeared in stories, paintings, and advertisements. Its meals and toilet habits were slowly being systematized. The modern house cat was no longer just a shadow in the corner. It was a presence, soft, deliberate, and perfectly adapted to a world of carpets and curtains, tea times, and ticking clocks. A creature that had survived deserts, ships, plagues, and superstition, now curling up on embroidered cushions in the heart of the largest empire on earth. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the cat was about to make its final leap from useful companion and ornamental pet to a fully integrated member of the modern human household. Picture this. It's the early 1900s. The world is loud, smoky, industrial. Steam engines sigh in rail yards. Factory whistles scream at dawn. And in the shadows of all this metal and soot, there are cats. They're not pampered yet. No designer collars, no feather wands, no curated social media pages. These are working animals. Barn cats patrolling houghs for mice. Alley cats weaving through back streets behind bakeries and butcher shops. Ship cats curled in coils of rope, sailing between continents on coal-powered freighters. They're still doing the job they first took on 10,000 years ago in those dusty granaries of the Fertile Crescent, controlling pests, keeping the food supply safe. Quiet employees paid in rodents. Then the world goes to war. When World War I erupts in 1914, humans drag every piece of their civilization into the conflict. Railroads, factories, chemistry, and almost without planning it, cats. They slip into trenches as if they've been there for 1,000 years. Soldiers adopt them as mascots. A kitten appears in a dugout one day and never leaves, sleeping on piles of uniforms, curling up in helmets, walking casually along the rim of a trench, while shells whistle overhead. They're more than mascots. Rats love trenches. So do mice. Food, warmth, and human waste create a rodent paradise. Disease follows, so the cats are welcomed, even cherished. Young men far from home write letters about trench cats who sleep on their chests and purr through artillery barrages. It's hard to measure what that purring meant in a landscape of fear, but you can imagine it. A small, warm body vibrating with that low, steady sound. A reminder that somewhere outside the mud and wire, there is still softness in the world. At sea, cats are officially part of the crew. Naval ships and merchant vessels bring them aboard to protect precious food stores from rats. Photographs show sailors cradling kittens on battleships, a strange contrast of tiny paws and huge guns. Some ship cats become legends in their own right, their stories passed from ship to ship like lucky charms. They cross oceans, survive storms, adapt to life on heaving metal decks. 5,000 years ago, their ancestors rowed the boats of Egyptian traders down the Nile. Now they're sailing in steel across the Atlantic. World War II only deepens this connection. Again, the world fractures. Again, humans find themselves in trenches and bunkers and submarines. And again, cats follow. In bombed-out cities, people risk precious food to share scraps with neighborhood cats. Soldiers in North Africa and the Pacific name their feline companions, pose for photos with them, write about them in diaries that still survive. In a time of rationing, blackouts and constant bad news, cats become tiny islands of normally, something soft to touch when everything else has turned to metal and stone. But while wars rage, another quiet revolution is gathering strength. Not on battlefields, but in basement and hardware stores. It's 1947 in Michigan. A young man named Ed Lowe is working in his family's industrial absorbents business. They sell things like clay and sand for mopping up oil and grease. A neighbor comes by with a problem. Her cat uses a box filled with ashes as a toilet, but the ashes are messy and track everywhere. She wants sand. Ed doesn't have clean sand on hand. He offers her a bag of a special dried clay, instead called Fuller, as earth. She takes it home. A few days later, she comes back. She wants more. The clay, she says, is incredible. It absorbs urine, traps odor, and doesn't turn the whole house into a gray dust storm. Ed notices something. There's a pattern here. People love their cats, but they hate the mess. If he can solve the mess, he can change how people live with cats. He starts bagging the clay, and almost as an afterthought, gives it a name: kitty litter. 2 simple words that will rewrite feline history. Before this moment, indoor cats are possible, but difficult. You need newspapers, sand, ashes, constant cleaning, and an extremely high tolerance for smell. The easiest solution is still to let the cat roam outdoors, even if it means crossing busy streets, encountering dogs, or disappearing for days. Cats are half in the house, half in the world. Commercial cat litter quietly smashes that barrier. Suddenly, you can keep a cat entirely indoors and not have your home smell like a barn. Apartment dwellers in crowded cities, people without yards, families living in cold climates, where opening doors in winter is brutal. Now they can all have cats comfortably inside. This is the hinge of the story. The moment when the cat turns slowly from outdoor worker to indoor companion. At the same time, human life is transforming too. After World War II, in many countries, especially the United States, there's a boom in suburban living. Cities spill out into rings of single-family houses with lawns, sidewalks, and driveways. Garages replace stables, supermarkets replace street markets, and in these new neighborhoods, cats reinvent themselves once again. The barn cat moves to the backyard. The alley cat becomes the neighborhood cat, slinking from yard to yard, lounging on porches, napping on warm car hoods. Inside, another type of feline appears, the strictly indoor pet, reclining on sofas, watching birds through picture windows, snoozing on television sets that hum with warm vacuum tubes. The rhythm of cat life changes. No longer tied to barns or docks, they live on cul-de-sacs and fifth-floor walk-ups. 19th-century cats might have hunted in fields. 20th-century cats hunt the mysterious red dot of a flashlight on a living room wall. As their role shifts, human attitudes toward their health shift too. Early in the century, veterinary medicine is largely focused on horses, livestock, and to a lesser extent, dogs. Cats are often seen as semi-wild, adaptable, and replaceable. But by mid-century, that changes. As more cats move indoors and onto laps, they move into the vet's office too. Vaccines for common feline diseases become widely available. Veterinarians start to specialize in cats, learning that feline physiology isn't just small dog with whiskers, but its own intricate system. Conditions like feline leukemia virus and panleukopenia are identified and studied. Parasite control becomes routine, sparing countless cats from slow, quiet suffering. Most transformative of all is the spread of spaying and neutering. At first, these surgeries are controversial. Some people think it's unnatural, or worry it will change their cat's personality. But the numbers are impossible to ignore. With better food, safer homes, and less disease, cats start living longer and reproducing more. Strays multiply in alleys and vacant lots. Shelters fill to overflowing. The line between beloved pet and unwanted litter becomes painfully visible. Animal welfare activists, many of them starting as quiet local volunteers, begin to push for widespread sterilization. Over the decades, spay and neuter campaigns spread. Posters go up in vet offices and community centers. Low-cost clinics appear. By the late 20th century, in many places, altering pet cats becomes the default, not the exception. The goal isn't to control cats for convenience alone. It's to spare future kittens from lives of hunger, disease, and abandonment. Alongside this, a new idea takes shape. Trap, neuter, return, or TNR. Rather than simply removing feral cats and euthanizing them, volunteers trap them humanely, have them spayed or neutered, vaccinate them, and then return them to their territories. Ear tipped to mark their status. These cats can live out their lives without adding to the population. It's not a perfect solution, and debates about feral cats remain intense, but it marks a shift in thinking from seeing stray cats as pests to seeing them as beings whose lives, even outside the home, have value. While all this is unfolding in the real world, another army of cats is staking a claim in a different kind of landscape, the screens of the 20th century. In the 1910s and 1920s, silent film gives birth to one of the first global cartoon icons, Felix the cat. He's not realistic. He doesn't purr or chase mice. He morphs, stretches, and breaks logic with a smug little grin. But he captures something essential about how humans see cats. Elastic, clever, always a bit mysterious and self-possessed. At a time when most real cats are still chasing barn rats, Felix is already living full-time in human imagination. Mid-century Tom and Jerry burst onto TV and cinema screens. Tom, the eternally frustrated house cat, chasing Jerry through endless slapstick battles, becomes a familiar image in homes around the world. The show isn't about real feline behavior. It's a cartoon war, but the very premise, a cat living indoors in a comfortable modern house, is a snapshot of a new normal. Then, in 1978, a lasagna-loving orange tabby named Garfield saunters onto newspaper pages. Garfield doesn't catch mice. He sleeps, eats, judges human, and delivers sarcastic commentary on modern life. He's the fully domesticated cat, distilled into pure attitude. By the end of the century, plush Garfields dangle from car windows, and his face is printed on mugs, pajamas, and lunchboxes. Cats, once sacred in temples and feared as witches' familiars, now sell coffee mugs with jokes about naps. But while media turns cats into symbols and punchlines, science starts asking quieter, deeper questions. What's really going on in that furry head? How do cats think? And what is a purr exactly? Early in the century, animal behavior studies focus more on dogs, primates, and laboratory rodents. Cats are often called untrainable or aloof, and scientists ignore them. Gradually, that changes. Researchers begin observing feral cat colonies, house cats, and those lineal neighborhood cats who slip between worlds. They notice social structures that are more flexible than pack animals, but not as solitary as once assumed. Mother cats cooperate in raising kittens. Unrelated cats form loose alliances around reliable food sources. The purr, long assumed to be a simple sign of contentment, reveals layers. Recordings show that cats purr not just when they're happy, but when they're injured, anxious, even dying. Analyses find that the frequency of the purr often falls in a range that can promote bone healing and tissue repair in laboratory conditions. Scientists begin to float hypotheses. Maybe purring isn't just a signal to others, but a kind of internal therapy, a built-in healing mechanism. Cognition studies test whether cats recognize their own names, follow pointing gestures, remember problem-solving tasks over time. The picture that emerges is subtle. Cats aren't small dogs, and they don't always perform on command. But they do form mental maps of their homes, track the movement of their humans by sound alone, and learn routines with impressive precision. They know when it's dinner time. They know where the treat cabinet is. They know when the carrier appears. Good things usually do not follow. As science discovers more about what cats need to thrive, a new debate stirs, one that will only grow louder in the 21st century. Should cats be allowed to roam outside? For millennia, the question didn't exist. A cat was an outdoor animal who might visit the indoors. But now with traffic, high-rise buildings, and dense urban environments, the outdoors is more dangerous. Cars, dogs, predators, poisons, even well-meaning people who don't like strays, all pose risks. Vets and animal welfare groups begin to notice that indoor-only cats tend to live longer lives, free from many common injuries and infections. At the same time, ecologists raise alarms about cats hunting birds and small mammals, especially in areas where local species have never evolved with feline predators. Studies in some regions suggest that free-roaming cats can put serious pressure on vulnerable wildlife populations. The cat, once a guardian of granaries and ships, is now powerful enough to reshape suburban ecosystems. And yet, there's another side. Outdoor access gives many cats exercise, mental stimulation, and a chance to express their full behavioral repertoire: climbing, stalking, exploring. For people who grew up with door-flap cats who came and went with the sunrise, the idea of a cat who never touches grass can feel wrong, even cruel. So, the 20th century ends with a tension that is never fully resolved. On one side, safety, conservation, long lifespans on soft couches. On the other, freedom, risk, and the ancient thrill of the hunt. People experiment with compromises: leash walking, chaos, and enclosed gardens, supervised yard time, but there is no single answer that satisfies everyone. What is clear is this: by the time the century closes, the domestic cat has completed an extraordinary journey. From nameless barn shadows to beloved household members, from working pest control to furry family, from alley survivor to subject of scientific papers and Saturday morning cartoons. They still carry the instincts of their wild ancestors, and every pounce and tail twitch. But their world has narrowed and deepened from open fields and harbor docks to living rooms, bedrooms, and sunny windowsills. They have moved slowly and silently from the margins of human life to its center, and in the glow of late-night television, while the world outside hums with cars and neon, a cat curls at the foot of a bed, purring. 10,000 years of shared history, contained in the rise and fall of a sleeping chest. A soft paw flexing against a blanket, a sound like distant, rolling thunder in miniature. The stage is set for their next conquest. Not just our homes, but our screens, our cameras, our entire digital imagination. Picture the screen in front of you, a pale rectangle of light in a dark room. You're tired. Your brain is buzzing with half-finished tasks, unanswered emails, and vague worries about tomorrow. You don't want a lecture. You don't want breaking news. You just want something soft, something simple, something that doesn't ask anything of you. So, you open a video. A cat appears. It blinks. It misjudges a jump. It squeaks instead of meowing. And suddenly, without quite knowing why, you feel your shoulders drop. Your breathing slow. Your mind, which has been running in circles all day, begins to follow a single small animal padding across a kitchen floor. This is where our story has brought us. 12,000 years after wild cats slipped into the first granaries, after Egypt carved them into stone, after sailors smuggled them onto ships, and Victorians brought them into parlors, cats have discovered a new habitat. The internet. They didn't plan this. They never do. But look at the numbers, and it's hard to escape the conclusion. In the digital age, cats might be the most successful non-human influencers on Earth. Before there were platforms and algorithms and content strategies, there were message boards, dial-up modems, grainy digital cameras that stored 20 photos if you were lucky. People were already sharing cat stories then, descriptions of odd habits, low-resolution photos of orange tabbies sleeping in shoeboxes, little text-based shrines to specific cats that nobody outside a tiny circle would ever meet in person. Then, in the early 2000s, something shifted. Image hosting got easier. Bandwidth increased. Suddenly, you could share not just a description of your cat, but their actual face, their posture, the exact way their ears tilted when they were confused. Out of this, an entire dialect of the internet emerged. Ill cats, macros, photos of cats with blocky white text pasted over them in deliberately broken English. Icon cheeseburger ceiling cat is watching you. It was nonsense and parody, and in a strange way a kind of storytelling. Millions of people scattered all over the world took their intensely personal affection for a single animal sleeping on their couch and turned it into a shared language. Then came YouTube. If photos could capture the stillness of a cat, videos could capture everything else. The chaos, the sudden, explosive, gravity-defying sprints at 3 o'clock in the morning, the mistrust of cucumbers, the determination to sit in boxes that were clearly too small, and the shock when it somehow worked. Anyway, cat videos became one of the first truly global genres of online content. Before professional creators dominated the platform, before brands and studios carved out their territories, there were short, shaky clips, titled simply, "My Cat Being Weird," or "Funniest Cat Ever," viewed millions of times, passed from inbox to inbox, embedded on countless blogs. As social media grew up, cats came with it. Facebook timelines filled with photos of adopted kittens, Twitter accounts narrated from the cat's point of view, Instagram feeds that were nothing but a single cat in different sunbeams day after day. Platforms changed, algorithms shifted, but the patterns stayed constant. Give humans the ability to share fragments of their lives at scale, and very quickly, those fragments fill up with cats. Some of those cats became something new. Not just pets, not just companions, but celebrities. Grumpy Cat, whose real name was Tardar Source, appeared first as a single photograph. A small cat with a permanently displeased expression due to a combination of feline dwarfism and underbite. The internet turned that face into a mirror, into every irritated emotion people didn't feel safe expressing. Nope, I had fun once. It was awful. Within a few years, Grumpy Cat had merchandise lines, book deals, and public appearances. Reporters interviewed her owner. Photographers chased her down convention hallways. A single cat, who had no idea any of this was happening, generated millions of dollars of economic activity. Lil Bub followed another path. Tiny tongue permanently sticking out, bones malformed by genetic conditions. She looked like a creature from a children's storybook. People responded not just to her cuteness, but to her visible vulnerability. Her owner used that attention to raise money for animal charities and shelters. An unlikely star turned into a force for funding veterinary care and adoption programs. A disabled cat, who might have been quietly euthanized in a different era, became a global symbol of resilience and gentleness. In Japan, Maru climbed into boxes. That was all. Over and over again. Long cardboard boxes. Tiny cardboard boxes. Boxes that clearly could not contain him. Except that somehow, through sheer determination and an alarming flexibility, they did. His videos drew tens of millions of views. He became so popular that researchers actually studied why people liked watching him so much. The answer was deceptively simple. It made them feel good, calm, amused, but in a quiet, low-stress way. This is one of the mysteries of the digital age. In a world overflowing with high-budget entertainment, special effects, and carefully engineered addictive content, why do so many people still choose again and again to watch a cat playing with a crumpled receipt? Psychologists have some ideas. When you see something cute, round face, big eyes, small body, your brain fires up circuits originally tuned for infant care, nurturing responses, protective instincts. These circuits are deeply wired. They're about survival, not logic. A kitten tumbling off a couch onto a soft rug can trigger the same wave of tenderness as a human, baby reaching for your finger. At the same time, cat videos are low stakes. The plot is never complicated. The outcome is rarely tragic. You can watch for 10 seconds or 10 minutes and step away easily. Compared to news feeds full of conflict and crisis, a cat trying to catch a laser pointer is emotional breathing room, a tiny portable pocket of safety. Studies suggest that people who watch cat videos report lower stress, more positive emotions, even a bit of relief from guilt and anxiety. It's not therapy in the clinical sense, but it's soothing, predictable, shareable. You send a cat clip to a friend, and you're not just sharing entertainment, you're sending a tiny wordless message. Take a break. Breathe. Here's something gentle. While the internet was busy turning cats into memes and minor deities, scientists were quietly using digital tools for something else, to understand cats as a species better than ever before. Geneticists began sequencing cat DNA on a massive scale. House cats from different continents, feral cats from islands and ports, pedigreed show cats with carefully tracked lineages. When they compared all these genomes, patterns emerged. They could see the signature of those first domestication events in the Near East, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. They could see how cats hitched rides along trade routes, their genes spreading from grain stores in the Fertile Crescent to ports on the Mediterranean, then out along shipping lanes to Asia, Africa, and eventually the Americas and Oceania. An invisible migration traced not by pottery fragments and stone tools, but by tiny variations in DNA. Modern studies suggest that nearly all domestic cats on Earth today descend from a single wild ancestor species, Felis sylvestris liber, the Near Eastern wildcat. As empires rose and fell, as languages shifted and religions changed, the cats kept moving. Now, in the age of spreadsheets and satellites, we can finally map their path with some precision. Each hair you sweep off your couch carries a barcode of history. Scientists are also using data to explore the cat-human bond itself. Surveys, heart rate monitors, brain imaging experiments. They show something that cat owners have suspected for a long time. Cats notice us. They track our movements, our routines, the tone of our voices. They recognize their names, even if they choose to ignore them. They form attachments that in many cases look strikingly similar to those of human infants, toward their caregivers. Not always, not every cat, but often enough to be more than coincidence. All of this is happening against a backdrop of sheer numbers that would have stunned the farmers who let wild cats into their granaries. By many estimates, there are now more than 600 million cats in the world. Some live in apartments and houses, eating carefully formulated diets, and visiting veterinarians for regular checkups. Others live on farms and in workshops, semi-feral, tolerated as long as they catch mice. Millions more inhabit the in-between spaces, alleys, docks, abandoned lots, urban parks. Some are fed by volunteers, others rely on dumpsters and hunting. This global feline population has become the center of new ethical debates. Outdoor cats, especially in places where native wildlife evolved without feline predators, can cause significant ecological damage. Songbirds, small mammals, reptiles. In some regions, conservationists argue that free-roaming domestic cats are among the most destructive invasive species on Earth. That's one perspective. On the other side, many cat advocates argue that cats are now so deeply woven into human society that treating them as simply invasive misses the point. They didn't choose to be spread to islands and suburbs. We brought them, we bred them, we made the conditions under which they now live. The responsibility, they say, is ours to manage them humanely. Out of this tension emerge practices like trap new to return, in which feral cats are captured, sterilized, vaccinated, and released back into their territories with the goal of stabilizing and gradually reducing colony sizes without mass killing. Supporters point to declining populations in some areas. Critics worry that even stable colonies keep predation pressure on vulnerable species, and so the debate continues unfolding in city council meetings, academic conferences, and online comment sections. Within homes, questions of ethics take other forms. Should cats be kept strictly indoors where they are safer from cars, predators, and disease, but confined to a limited space? Or should they be allowed to roam, expressing natural behaviors, even if it shortens their lives and threatens wildlife? Is it responsible to buy certain designer breeds, deliberately created for particular looks, flattened faces, hairlessness, extremely short legs, when those traits can come with chronic health problems and discomfort? Some argue that any deliberate breeding in a world full of homeless cats is morally questionable. Others maintain that ethical, health-focused breeding can improve overall feline well-being. These aren't new questions exactly. People have been arguing about animals and ethics for centuries. What's new is the scale and speed. One viral post about a kitten mill, or a controversial breed, or an urban cat cull can be seen by millions in hours. The internet that made cats famous has also turned them into a focal point for discussions about what kind of relationship humans want with the rest of the living world. Then, in 2020, another event pushed that relationship into sharper focus: a pandemic. Lockdowns, offices closed, streets emptied, people suddenly confined to their homes, facing an invisible threat and an uncertain future. Loneliness became a global public health issue. Screens were our main connection to work, to friends, to everything outside our walls. Into that anxious stillness, countless people brought cats. Shelters reported surges in adoption and fostering. Waiting lists formed for kittens. Older, harder-to-place cats that had been overlooked for months were suddenly going home. People who had put off adopting because of travel or office schedules realized they might not have this much time at home again. Daily life changed. Video meetings started with the usual greetings, then a pause while everyone admired the tabby who had just walked across someone's keyboard. Entire compilations appeared of cats interrupting Zoom calls, turning embarrassment into shared laughter. In a time when many kinds of physical closeness were risky, the warm weight of an animal sleeping beside you took on a new significance. Researchers studying mental health during the pandemic found that companion animals, including cats, were often cited as crucial sources of comfort. Routine, feeding, grooming, playing, gave structure to days that might otherwise have blurred into one another. Stroking fur reduced heart rates and stress hormones. The simple knowledge that another living being was in the room, breathing, blinking, occasionally demanding food at exactly the wrong moment, anchored people who felt unmed. If the agricultural revolution gave us cats as grain guardians, and the Victorian era gave us cats as cherished indoor companions, the pandemic era highlighted another role: cats as co-isolated partners, sharing a very modern kind of uncertainty. And beyond this present moment, the future of cats keeps unfolding. Biotechnology is probing the edges of what is possible. Cloning services offer for a high price to create genetic copies of beloved cats that have died. The result looks similar, sometimes eerily so, but it is not the same individual. Behavior and personality are shaped by more than DNA, by chance, by environment, by the subtle interactions that start at birth. Still, for some grieving owners, the idea of continuity is compelling. Genetic editing raises other possibilities. Could we, in theory, engineer cats who are hypoallergenic, or who do not hunt wildlife, or who are resistant to common diseases? Technically, perhaps ethically, the questions are far more complex. At what point does a cat shaped and sculpted by human preference at the genetic level become something fundamentally different from the opportunistic wildcats who first crept into our storage rooms? At the same time, more ordinary forms of future cat are already emerging. Breeds tuned for apartment living, interactive toys and feeders that connect to smartphones, GPS collars, and health trackers that upload data to the cloud. Somewhere right now, a person on a different continent can open an app, watch a live video of their cat napping in a sunbeam, and remotely dispense a treat. The species that once survived by stalking mice under starlight is now in many homes monitored by infrared cameras and machine learning algorithms that track its movement patterns. A veterinarian might one day diagnose arthritis or heart disease, not by waiting for visible symptoms, but by analyzing months of subtle behavioral data automatically collected from the cat's everyday life. And through all of this, through memes and merchandise, genetic maps and ethical arguments, cats remain what they have always been, soft-footed predators who somehow found a way to live among us, without ever entirely belonging to us. On your screen, a video loops a kitten chasing its tail, spinning in clumsy circles until it topples over, blinking with unbothered confusion. On your couch, perhaps a real cat curls into a denser circle, tail over nose, ears flicking at sounds you can't hear. From the first grain stores to fiber-optic cables, from torches to touchscreens, we have been watching them. And in their own quiet way, they have been watching us back. Picture this. Somewhere 12,000 years ago, in a dim granary at the edge of the first wheat fields, a small wild cat slips through the shadows. It isn't there for humans. It isn't there for friendship. It's there for mice, for survival, for instinct. Now, picture this. Tonight, that same lineage is curled at the foot of your bed, or pressed against your pillow, or sprawled across your laptop, refusing to move. The eyes are the same shape. The teeth are the same. The hunter's brain is still running in the background, but the world around the cat has changed beyond recognition. And somehow, through all of that, the cat has come along for the ride. For 12,000 years, cats have walked a strange path beside us. Not quite livestock, not quite tools, never fully under our control. Dogs were sculpted by human intention, generation after generation, shaped into guardians, herders, helpers. Cats did something different. They watched us. They approached on their own terms. They selected themselves. Even today, a domestic cat is astonishingly close to its wild cousins. The genes of a tabby in your living room and a Near Eastern wild cat stalking a rocky hillside are incredibly similar. The skeleton is almost identical. The hunting sequence, stalk, freeze, wiggle, pounce, is ancient, untouched. You can see it when a kitten chases a crumpled receipt. You can see 10,000 BC in your hallway at 3 o'clock a.m. That is the strange magic of cat domestication. We didn't really domesticate them in the way we domesticated cows or horses or sheep. We created an opportunity. Granaries full of rodents, villages full of shelter, ships full of food scraps. Cats stepped into that niche. The bold ones, the slightly more tolerant ones, the ones who could tolerate our clumsy affection and noisy homes. They thrived. Over time, they became smaller, more varied in color, a bit more social, but never fully tamed. They remain, in a very real sense, ambassadors from the wild, living in our houses, and in return for a place at the edges of our fires. They gave us far more than we usually notice. They gave us pest control long before the word existed. On the Nile, they guarded grain from the teeth of rats, protecting the food supply of entire kingdoms. On trading ships, they patrolled the holds and saved sailors from starvation in distant seas. In medieval streets, in barns and cellars, they were the silent line between stored harvests and ruin. But they also gave us something softer, something that's harder to measure in numbers or bones or coins. Companionship, the slow blink from across the room that feels suspiciously like trust. The warm weight on your chest after a hard day. The quiet purr vibrating through the darkness when the rest of the world feels uncertain. For centuries, people have written about cats as guardians of dreams, as keepers of secrets, as quiet witnesses to our private lives. They sat beside Egyptian scribes under oil lamps, curled beneath the chairs of Roman philosophers, hid under the benches of medieval taverns, posed stiffly in Victorian portraits, and then centuries later exploded into endless ridiculous gifts and videos, looping endlessly on phone screens across the planet. From sacred statues and temples to reaction memes on the internet, cats have remained themselves independent, unimpressed, occasionally affectionate, frequently mysterious. And that mystery is part of why we can't look away. Other domestic animals give us devotion, obedience, clear signals of emotion. Cats give us ambiguity, a tail flick that might mean irritation or might mean excitement, a sudden midnight sprint that could be play or could be some ancient desert hunter rehearsing for a life it will never need to lead. We project stories into those silences. We wonder what they're thinking as they stare into corners we can't see. In every era, that combination of closeness and distance has fascinated us. A creature that lives in our homes, but seems to belong somehow to another world. And yet despite all the legends, all the superstitions, all the centuries of fear and adoration, the core relationship is simple. We give them shelter, food, warmth, and a place to sleep in the sun. They give us a little control over the pests that would eat our food. They give us a soothing presence in lonely rooms. They give us something to care for that is never fully ours. They give us laughter, comfort, heartbreak, and the soft echo of wild grasslands in every purr. If you've come this far in the story through ancient fields, temple walls, plague-ridden streets, Victorian parlors, and all the way to the digital age, thank you for sharing this journey through 12,000 years of purring. If you'd like to keep exploring histories like this, you can gently tap like and subscribe to join our little community here. It helps more than you might think, and it lets us keep making long, calm stories for you to fall asleep to. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. A city apartment, a dorm room, a farmhouse, a ship at sea. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your country or your city. And if you have a cat, tell us their name and maybe one small story about them. Somewhere out there, someone else falling asleep might be listening with their own cat tucked under the covers. If you want to go one step further, there's also an optional channel membership here on YouTube. It's never expected, but it's greatly appreciated. Members help support the time and research that go into these long, quiet journeys. And any support of any kind, including simply watching and resting, is received with real gratitude. For now, wherever you are, lights low, headphones on, a cat purring nearby, or just the memory of one, I hope your mind feels a little softer, a little calmer, knowing the path that brought those soft paws to your pillow. From the wild edges of the first farms to the quiet of your room tonight, thank you for spending this time exploring the history of cats. Rest well, and may your dreams be accompanied by 12,000 years of gentle purring.